Dragonbond, Chapter 12. A faint light came from ahead, from around the bend in one of the Myriad tunnels Zala's infiltration team had spent the last 4 days navigating. It brightened the uneven earthen walls, the passages carved out by picks and shovels over several years. Dampness moistened those walls, water dribbling down and joining a tiny stream that ran down the middle of the tunnel, trickling past the boots of Zala and her infiltration team. These were not the passages beneath Mount Slash, not the ones they would need Talon to guide them through. They were part of an extensive subterranean network that her people had been using for years. Copious tunnels led to and around the outskirts of the underground warrens where humans had found safety. The journey was taking longer than it normally would, since Zala hadn't wanted to bring Talon through any of their settlements or into well-traveled areas, especially when everyone on her team was questioning her and her decision to rely on him. Oh, they didn't openly question her, but she heard the whispers, saw the looks exchanged when they thought she had her back turned. The gossip had spread, and everyone knew their general had been having sex with their prisoner. Because of that, they now doubted her, believing Talon held some magical sway over her. They also regarded him with more weariness than they had before, and even though these were familiar passages where dragons had never been seen, they seemed nervous every time they came to a dark intersection. They fingered their weapons and peered into the dim recesses as if they expected an ambush at any moment. Nobody had tried to get out of the mission, but she could feel her people's loss of confidence in her, and that stung. She even caught Colonel Sander giving her concerned glances whenever Talon stood close to her, as if he hadn't been the one to suggest that she seduce Talon. Apparently, he hadn't meant for his suggestion to include the sucking of cocks. He probably considered that degrading, something prostitutes might do for money, not something a general should do for anyone, certainly not some prisoner. Zala had not thought of Talon as a prisoner from the beginning, from that first instant where her sword alerted her that he was a dragon. They'd had a deal, that was all. She had not considered him someone she controlled or should control. She wasn't sure if it should bother her that he had caught her arm back in that tent, pulling her close and asking for her to use her mouth on him. He hadn't insisted, it wasn't as if he controlled her, but she had wanted to please him, even though she had known she should have been attending to her duty then. He might not control her, but he definitely had a hold over her, and that did worry her a little. Her body tingled at the memory of their night together, and she found herself looking back to make sure he wasn't far. She had ignored his brushes against her during the days of this journey, and the way he had propositioned her with his eyes even though he did not speak of sex. She had resisted the urge to sulk off into an alcove with him at night. She didn't want her people thinking that she couldn't keep her hands off him, or that they couldn't trust her because her lust was controlling her. A ludicrous notion. Zala slowed to a stop at the bend. She peered into the gloom behind Talon, who stood by her shoulder as he usually did now, and waved for Vorkon to approach. 25 men and women made up the infiltration team, including Vorkon and Lieutenant Selena. The group had heretofore passed silently through the tunnels, under the desert, and then under the mountains. Even their own people never knew of their passing. But the jungle waited up ahead, and that was a dragon's stronghold these days. The great scaled creatures seemed to love the lush foliage, the humidity and heat, the plentiful water sources. They would be all over out there, and unfortunately this was as close as Zala's team could get to Mount Slash without walking into the open. When they reached the extinct volcano that held the dragon headquarters, they should be able to slip into another set of tunnels, the one Colonel Sander and his spy team had discovered before. Once inside, she hoped it would be hard for the large dragons to swoop in and attack them. Talon could lead them to the top of the mountain, and they could put to use the black powder explosives her team carried. She had not mentioned them to Talon, and hoped he would not be angry when he found out, that he wouldn't resent them trying to take out as many dragons as they could, not just the king. Need to get there before worrying about that, Zala muttered to herself. Vorkon trotted up to join her, his bow on his back, the tip scraping against the low ceiling as he neared. "Ma'am?" Vorkon eyed Talon, then pointedly turned his back on him. "Scout ahead," Zala said. "Not far, but let us know if you spot any dragons, and what time of day it is, too. We'll wait until dark to make the crossing to Mount Slash, but I want an idea if anyone is waiting for us." She glanced at Talon. "No, at his collar. I'm hoping that the female wasn't able to track him while we were underground, but it is a possibility." "Yes, ma'am." As Vorkin trotted for the end of the tunnel, Colonel Sander finished a conversation with a couple of junior officers and walked up to join her. "A word, General?" He looked at Talon, the only person standing close, then tilted his head toward a spot farther up the tunnel. Zala followed him, glancing back to make sure Talon did not follow. He often reminded her of someone's bodyguard in the way he stayed close, watching her and glaring to keep the rest of the world away. But she didn't need a bodyguard. "Some concerns have been voiced to me, Zala," Sander said quietly. "Concerns I thought you should hear about." "Go on," she said, though she was cringing inside. She had already heard the gossip and could guess the basis for these concerns. "Some of the men worry that this has all been a setup, that your prisoner is leading us into a trap. Coming here was my idea. With that collar, he can't communicate with his people, so he couldn't have warned anyone of our plans. Or so she hoped. Dragons have mind powers. Perhaps the collar isn't real. You and I don't have magic, so we have no true way to know. It could all be an elaborate ruse to rid us of 2 storm swords. If people are worried about traps, they can stay behind," Zala said. "I said that when I first returned to camp. I asked for volunteers for this, since no orders came down from the king. It's a chance to strike a mighty blow. I have to take the chance that this is all for real, that he won't betray us. It's just without precedent." "I know, but he seems to be unique among his people." Sander looked frankly at her, but he kept his mouth shut. If he thought she was talking about Talon's cock being unique, she was glad he didn't voice the words. Vorkon returned sooner than Zala had expected. "Trouble?" she asked. "It depends." Vorkin's gaze flicked to the stormsword sheathed at her waist. "Would you consider 4 dragons waiting in front of the entrance to the tunnels to be trouble, or a warm-up battle?" "Dragons are always trouble." 4 of them. Zala grimaced. Even with her team behind her, there was no way she and Selena could handle so many. "Tell me about it." Vorkon frowned at Talon. Talon had been the recipient of a lot of frowns these last few days. Zala understood her people's concerns, but she wished they would treat him better. He would be a dragon again one day. Why didn't they realize that treating him well now might make it so he would hesitate to attack them later? Or was she a fool for believing that? No, she couldn't believe he would be so different just because he occupied a different body later. His mind was still his mind, wasn't it? "Tandor," Zala called. "Selena." Her lieutenant ran up to join them, along with a short, wiry man with a heavy backpack. 4 dragons, Zala said. "I have many explosives if you wish for me to set a distraction somewhere, ma'am." Tandor reached over his shoulder to give his back a loving pat. Talon's eyebrows rose, but he appeared more puzzled than angry. He might not know the word. "These are dragons that we gain nothing by fighting, right?" Sander asked. "I say we find a way to slip past them." Zala nodded. She was inclined to say the same thing, but it sounds like they're waiting for us. Vorkon nodded. They were looking right towards this tunnel exit. They clearly expected someone to come out of it, and dragons are too big to fit in unless they shape change. Something few of them seemed inclined to do. Perhaps they considered it demeaning to take a lesser form. "Are they waiting for us?" Sander looked at Talon. "We're waiting for him." "It's possible that female was tracking his collar," Zala said. "I don't know if all of his kind could sense it." She waved for Talon to come closer, though he was already watching and listening to the conversation. "Also, we know dragons can sense our swords." "Not from far away," Sander said, "or you would never have pulled off some of those sneak raids you've done over the years." Zala shifted her weight, aware of Talon drawing close. He was such a proponent of honor that she didn't know how he would feel about sneak raids if he knew about them. "Semtrusus could have told others about my escape," Talon said. "I'm not sure how far away the collar can be sensed, but many females are more sensitive to magic than males. Also, we're not that deep underground, are we? And we haven't been for most of this journey." He eyed the stone and dirt ceiling. Here and there, roots dangled through the cracks. "A dragon flying above ground could have found us. Found me." "We could send him out there while we sneak out another tunnel exit," Sanders said. "Send him out by himself to deal with 4 dragons?" Zala resisted the urge to lay a protective hand on Talon's forearm as she frowned at Sander. "If we deal with them, those 4 dragons will tell all of their people that we're here. Right now, they know he's here, but they can only suspect about us, right? If they see our team, they'll have an idea right away as to what we're planning. Do you have any suggestions, Talon? Zala asked. Yes. Free me. He touched his collar. I'll provide your diversion if I can fly. We need you to help us through those tunnels, not get mauled by 4 dragons. I'm a fast flyer. I can avoid them, then shapeshift into something small to avoid their notice. Then I can meet up with you again later. He lifted his chin, appearing fearless at the idea. A female dragon had been trying to kill him all along. Zala hated the idea of sending him off alone. May I speak privately with you, General? Talon asked, speaking formally in front of her soldiers. She appreciated that. Even if everyone had heard about her sexual adventures, she didn't need to flaunt that they had a relationship. Yes. Zala walked a few steps with him, waiting for the others to retreat. She did not want to get too close to the exit, not with dragons peering in. When she spoke, she kept her voice quiet. What is it? Talon regarded her gravely. Do you doubt that I'll return to fulfill my part of the deal? No, she said without hesitation. Assuming you're able, I don't doubt that you will. I do worry that if 4 dragons take off after you'll be injured. Or worse. Do you? He gazed into her eyes. Worry. Yes. His face softened with a quick smile. Good. I was concerned that my greed back in the tent may have upset you. Your greed, no. Her body heated, just remembering him wrapping his arms around her from behind, pressing his hard body against hers. That the corporal walked in, yes. I regret that moment, too. Talon lifted a hand touching his collar. I believe you when you say you trust me to return, but I sense you are reluctant to cut this off me. She looked away, 1,000 excuses popping into her head, but she spoke the truth. I am. Why? I'll be able to protect myself then. I won't be a burden on you. His eyes burned into hers, and urgency filled his words. Yes, she could tell how much he longed for this. Was she cruel to deny him? I don't consider you a burden. I'm glad I've been able to protect you. Protecting people is what I do. Granted, you're my first dragon. He frowned, failing to see her humor. Maybe it was poor humor. You wish me to remain weak? No, I just... Speak openly. Please. Talon lifted a hand as if to touch her face, but he glanced toward her soldiers, many of whom were watching this conversation, and let it drop to his side again. I believe you'll change and have no interest in me, she murmured. It's selfish, I know. I've only recently realized it's a big reason for my reluctance. That and that my people will be uneasy if you're walking beside us in your full power and could change any time. She shook her head, avoiding his eyes, ashamed that she wanted to keep him caged, to keep him with her as he was. She couldn't have said why she cared so much, aside from the fact that he had been such a delightful and enthusiastic lover, and perhaps because they were similar in many ways. He understood what it was to command. If they remained together in the future, he might become someone she could confide in. There was nobody else like that for her, and she admitted to herself that it was lonely. But that wasn't an acceptable reason to keep him chained. Zala took a deep breath. Let's do it. You're right. You'll be stronger and able to deal with problems, and our enemies will no longer be able to track that collar. She pointed back toward the others, wanting to light lanterns before she attempted this. Let's go back there. Zala, he murmured, catching her arm before she had gone a step. You are wrong. My feelings will not change. Good, she said, and nodded, though she doubted he was right. Maybe he believed the words himself, but once he changed back, she was positive his feelings would indeed change. He might have respected her when he had been a dragon, but he certainly hadn't lusted after her as they had been battling. Once he became a dragon again, he would wonder why he had ever wanted to endure the ignobility of being human. He released her so she could get lanterns, but he stayed by her side as they joined the soldiers, no doubt eager to have his collar removed. Zala gathered a few lanterns, turning up the flames as high as she could, and looked around for a place she could try this. Talon sat on a boulder, then removed his jacket, lifting his head to expose his neck. Doubt wormed through Zala, even as she drew her sword and stepped close. She had already examined the collar, and knew the metal was molded to his skin, not leaving a gap anywhere. The jewel at the front of his throat might be less strong than the metal. It also might contain the magic. Could it be the weak link? If she broke that, would the rest be broken? Even if the metal did not fall away, if it no longer acted as a beacon and stifled his magic, then he could likely break it himself when he transformed. "I'm going to try to gently slice it off first," Zala said. "I'm accurate with my swings, but I wouldn't care to cut through more than metal here." "I agree with that sentiment," Talon said. "Lieutenant Selena," Xander said, flicking a finger. Selena did not come too close, but she drew her sword and made it clear she would stand nearby, in case Talon attacked them as soon as he was free. Zala sighed, knowing he wouldn't, but she did not object to Selena's presence. Talon barely glanced at the lieutenant and her sword. He kept his gaze on Zala. She slid the sharp edge of her blade across the gem, applying some pressure, but aware of Talon's throat right behind it, aware that she could kill him accidentally if she wasn't extremely careful. Some of her men might not disapprove, but her soul ached so much at the idea of that unaccustomed nervousness afflicted her. Her hand trembled, and she paused to take a deep, steadying breath before continuing. Her magical blade scratched the gem, giving her hope. She pressed harder. When it did not crack, she risked making more of a strike, hitting the gem with speed and power, but precision too. Talon remained frozen, not blinking, not breathing. On the third strike, the gem cracked. It sounded like thunder in the enclosed tunnel, maybe because everyone was holding their breaths. Zala checked Talon's face. "Did that do anything?" His eyes flared with a violet glow, and she stumbled back, startled. Selena stepped forward, her sword held out, the clouds swirling inside the metal. Though alarmed, Zala kept her sword at her side, watching and waiting. Talon watched her back, holding her gaze as he slowly lifted his hands. He dug his fingers into the collar, not seeming to care that he mashed his own flesh. Then, with a quick pull, he tore it off. It snapped in half, and he dropped, through, both pieces to the rocky floor. The glow in his eyes faded as he massaged his neck. He stood, flexing his muscles visible with his jacket off, and shrugging his shoulders. Feet shuffled behind Zala. She did not have to look to know that Selena was not the only one with a weapon readied. But Talon did nothing more than flex his arms and study the muscled limbs briefly, as if considering his human body for the first time. He met Zala's eyes, and she swallowed, feeling the pull of him even more than she had before, an attraction to his body and also to the power that seemed to sizzle in the air around him. "I will divert the other dragons," Talon said, his voice resonating more than it had before, "and meet you at the base of Mount Slash at midnight. The tunnels leading into the mountain have been collapsed, but there is rubble. With those swords, you can cut through it. I will assist." He skewered Xander with his gaze. "You have been in the mountain before. You remember how to get to the entrance?" Zala shifted, worried Xander would think she had revealed that information. She had not. Had Talon stolen it from Xander's thoughts? Did he now have the ability to do so? "I remember," Xander said stiffly. "But if the tunnels have been collapsed, and we're looking for them at night, it may be difficult to locate them again." He nodded apologetically at Zala. Talon strode toward him, lifting a hand toward his face. Xander jumped back, grabbing for a sword as Selena leaped close with her own blade. Talon frowned at both of them. Xander's hand fell away from the hilt of his weapon. Selena licked her lips, but did not lower her weapon. No, she wouldn't. Storm swords did not choose their masters lightly. "I will impart the information," Talon said. "That is all." "By touching me?" Xander eyed the outstretched hand warily. "It is easier that way. I am unfamiliar with your mind." "Give me the information," Zala said. It's why I brought you, after all." She smiled, letting him know she was joking and hoping he would find her joke humorous. Talon nodded, his face difficult to read. He stepped close to her, and she made herself stand still, to trust him as he had done when she held her blade to his throat. He touched her temple, and a flood of images came into her mind, the lush jungle valley as seen from the sky above, the trails that animals took through it, and old roads that her people had once walked. She saw the mountain, the terrain around the rubble, that was what remained of the tunnel entrances. Then she saw miles of subterranean passages snaking around inside the mountain, leading gradually upward toward the top, and she also saw that there were traps along the way, traps that Talon had once played a hand in setting. It seemed that luck had favored her, for he had originally worked with the engineers who had human-proofed those passages. He had lent his military mind toward the project, and now he was giving her everything he knew. "Got it," she rasped, almost overwhelmed by the flood of information that crashed into her brain at once. "I can find it." Midnight. Instead of stepping away, he eased closer, sliding his hand around to the back of her head. He kissed her, his mouth eager and demanding as it took hers. "Nothing has changed," he whispered directly into her mind. "I still want you." His kiss could have turned her into a puddle at his feet even without the words, but an intense surge of pleasure rocketed through her at hearing them. It centered at her core, causing her to ache and throb with desire. For a moment she was almost as dazed as she was aroused, confused because he was only kissing her, but it felt as if he was also between her legs, sucking her as he had done on the cot, searing her with such pleasure that she nearly fell to her knees. Then he released her and stepped back. She gripped the boulder behind her. Had it not supported her, she might have fallen. He strode toward the bend, soldiers scattering as he passed. His head turned, and his eyes locked to hers as he disappeared from sight. Aware of men turning back to gape at her, her cheeks flushed from more than his touch. She glanced at her groin. She half expected to find her trousers around her ankles, some proof that he had somehow kissed her in both places at once, but her belt remained buckled. Had he done that with his mind? The possibility boggled her, but it titillated her too. "Well," Sanders said, and Zala straightened, telling her body it would have to wait until the mission was over to see if he meant what he said, what he'd thought. "Let's hope this fondness thing works." "Yes." Realizing her sword had tumbled from her grip during that kiss, Zala picked it up and sheathed it. When she had said that Talon was as dangerous as a man as he was as a dragon, she had not been lying.